Hola a todos, un gran saludo, yo soy Dani Mora quien les acompaña en este proyecto. Hoy retomaremos una temática sumamente importante en la terapia Gestalt con perspectiva de campo, que es el self. En esta oportunidad será como base el self como emergente del campo. Sabemos que en terapia Gestalt el aprendizaje es a modo de espiral, es decir, todos los conceptos se van entrelazando para poder entender este cuerpo teórico. Para esto tendremos un invitado de Inglaterra, él es Peter Philippson, él es psicoterapeuta desde hace 33 años, formador de terapia Gestalt registrado en el Consejo de Psicoterapia del Reino Unido. Es miembro docente y supervisor del Instituto de Psicoterapia y Formación Gestáltica del Reino Unido. Es miembro fundador del Centro Gestalt de Manchester y miembro de pleno derecho del Instituto de Terapia Gestalt de Nueva York. Es formador senior del Instituto de Terapia Gestalt en Eslovenia, también miembro de la facultad del Instituto Internacional de Psicopatología y Psicoterapia Gestalt en Turín. Es miembro del Consejo Asesor del Centro de Estudios Somáticos y al mismo tiempo miembro fundador del Grupo de Estudio Internacional de Terapia Gestalt sobre el Self emergente en el campo y la terapia. Además, es formador invitado para muchos programas de formación a nivel internacional y ha escrito numerosos artículos, colaboraciones y libros sobre terapia Gestalt. Como siempre, que disfruten de este encuentro. Bueno, doctor Peter, estoy sumamente agradecido de que haya aceptado la invitación. Para mí es un honor tenerlo en este espacio, sobre todo por el tema que nos convoca, que es el self emergente del campo, ¿no? Entonces, comenzamos con las preguntas. Ok. Entonces, la primera pregunta que tengo para usted es, ¿por qué es la perspectiva relacional de campo la que toma como principio activo de la terapia Gestalt? Incluso me gustaría saber a qué se refiere con principio activo.
Okay, that came out of a rather interesting experience that I was asked to contribute to a book to be published in Ukraine about the active principle in a number of different therapies. And could I write the Gestalt chapter? And the idea of the active principle is like with a medicine, what is it that gives it its effectiveness? So my affiliation in Gestalt therapy is to the early schools, the early ways of understanding it in the 1940s and 1950s. The center of that was a particular understanding of self as co-emerging with other, and if there was no other, there would be no meaning to self. So you're always looking at self-other configuration. So Gestalt therapy emerged from psychoanalysis, and the idea is not to try be a solution-focused therapy, but to explore the psychodynamics. But in psychoanalysis, the psychodynamics are internal psychodynamics, whereas the psychodynamics that Paul's proposed in Gestalt therapy is the dynamics of the co-creation of self and other in the contact situation. So the way of changing how somebody is in the world is not about exploring inside somebody's head, but looking how they put themselves in the world, what they were aware of, what they were not aware of, what contacts they'd make, what contacts they'd avoid. If you like, what the dance was that they most familiarly do in the world. And in the therapy, exploring the possibilities for a wider dance, for a wider way of engagement in the world.
Bueno, y aquí comenzamos entonces con esta gran pregunta y es ¿a qué se refiere con que el self es entonces un emergente del campo?
Human beings tend to see ourselves as outside the world and looking in on it. So in a group, for each person, there'd be some kind of sense of there's the group and then there's me. but of course that would be true of everybody in the group. And who we are and how we interact will be forming within that particular group context. But the way we would imagine it is that we have just come into this group which exists external to us. Yet, if I walk into a room in one way, very closed in, I will be met in a particular way in the room. If I go in a different way, more outwards, I'll be met in a different way. It's not just that I'd experience a room differently, but that I would be responded to differently. So there's this continuous field interaction between people and objects, changes as we change our way of engagement with it. Can I speak about a very specific thing that I've been looking at quite a lot, where a client, say a man, comes with difficulties in his marriage and wants help with the relationship with his wife. But there are 3 levels of complexity here. The first level is that the client is speaking to me as the therapist and is wanting to show himself in a certain way, either the good one while his wife's bad, or his wife as some kind of angel while he is messing up as always. The second level is that he's telling me about his wife as he experiences her. And I do a thought experiment with trainees to say, imagine this man goes home to his wife and describes you as the therapist. Do you think you would recognize yourself? And people laugh, and I say, well, why do you think you would recognize the wife if you met her? So that's the second level. The third level is that he's telling me about his wife as he experiences her, relating to him, as if that's an objective thing about the wife. So the example there is somebody who says, my wife bullies me. And I realize that this man is very passive. And if I was married to him, I would be bullying him, because otherwise we would never decide where to go on holiday or what color to paint the house. So I wouldn't know whether that woman would be seen as a bully by anybody else, or whether it's just a response to his passivity. So with all these 3 levels, the man is trying to get me to give him advice about how to make a better relationship with his wife. And the results can only be quite random. There's also a philosophical point, which is, are these 3 levels, are they distortions of some underlying reality that we can find by correcting for the distortions? Or are these perspectival levels all you ever get? And I would say the second. I mean, that's where I think that this perspective is so important. And what I find is that by exploring the dynamics of contact and self and other formation in the moment, change can happen very quickly. Another aspect of this is that in many therapies, the client comes and the therapist sees themselves as a skilled helper to support the client to make changes in accordance with their own theory. And if the client is not in tune with that theory, then the therapy doesn't work well, or the client's resistant. In a couple of therapies, Gestalt therapy and psychoanalysis, it's accepted that the therapist becomes for the client very many things depending on their experience. The helper, the one who's going to hurt them or abandon them, the lover, the friend. And this isn't a problem for the therapy, this is the center of the therapy, because in exploring those dynamics of encounter, they can be expanded and new things can happen. So if somebody has been hurt or abandoned in their early life by those who should be helping them, they will inevitably be coming to therapy suspicious of the therapist, maybe compliant with the therapist, but always not quite trusting the therapist. And it's in exploring those issues around trust that the ground of finding relationships which the client can trust can be supported. Another element is about psychopathology. A lot of work being done by my colleagues Gianni Franceschetti and Jan Rubal. And what they're saying is that the pathology that we meet in therapy is not belonging to the client, but was developed in relationship, is sustained in relationship, and shows itself in the therapy in the relationship. So an example of that is that we're in a schizoid process where somebody can have a really energized conversation with you from a cognitive level. If it becomes about emotion or intimacy or body, then it's suddenly as if I've switched language to Japanese. Then they just look at me. And then that problem isn't just their problem, it's my problem. How do I not just go back to the simpler cognitive way of relating, which I know I'll meet the client to a certain extent, but nothing new will happen. And yet it's not clear to either of us how we can change that. But what we can do is we can both become aware of that situation and work together. So I remember with one man, one day it was raining very heavily. I suggested we take our session out into the garden. With the rain running down us, we couldn't be disembodied. And we could find a different way of engaging with each other in that situation. You can follow that along, that the formation of that schizoid process, it usually doesn't involve any trauma or nastiness on behalf of the parents, but that's the same, exactly the same thing happens. The child comes with his or her excitement and body and wish for intimacy, and the parents suddenly act as if he switched to Japanese. They don't understand. So the client stays in the areas where he or she feels that the parents can be available, at least to some extent. So the child is in exactly the same situation in the childhood family that the therapist is in the therapy relationship, knowing something's missing, but not knowing what it is and how to engage with it, how to find a way through to it, because there's a blindness to it. And to know that allows a lot more possibilities. I'll give you an extreme example. A man came to see me with a diagnosis of schizophrenia. He said that his problem was about voices coming out of the walls. I could try and persuade him that those voices aren't really coming from the walls, but he probably had 100 people to tell him that. Or I could pretend that I could hear voices coming from the walls, but that wouldn't help. So what I said was I spoke from myself. I said, I can see an immediate problem here. The problem is I don't work well with walls. They don't listen to me. So if you're sure that this is about walls, then you need to know I'm incompetent. If you can open the possibility that you're involved in this somehow, then I'm competent again. Would you be willing to do that? And he thought for a reasonable amount of time, and then he said, yes, I'll try that. And then we could work together. And that seems like a very crazy thing, but it's actually very common. It's usually not about walls, though. It's, as I said, my wife bullies me, so I'll sit here while you change my wife. And exactly the same applies. It simplifies the interaction. I'm not the technician who's wanting to change where somebody is, but we are working together to expand the possible field of our contacting and awareness in the moment. Then that moves itself outside to new ways of engaging in the world. And what tends to happen is people find themselves doing different things.
Ahora bien, antes de continuar, esto que pudiera parecer una sutileza para algunos, para mí es importante, y es contacto y relación son lo mismo.
Oh, there's actually quite strong discussions in the Gestalt field about this, because contact is an immediate thing. Relationship has duration. When somebody is in a fixed way of relating to the world, then the relationships tend not to be very creative. They tend to also be fixed. And there is a need to go back to the immediacy of contact. I also think contact and relationship weave in and out of each other because it's in the relationship, even if it's a very short relationship, that the client can experiment with new kinds of contact. They don't do that with somebody they just meet on the street. There has to be some kind of relating. So I think they are kind of polar, that you move between contacts in the moment with the possibility of something really new, and relationship where something is assimilated, which then allows you to do something new. But they're not exactly the same thing, and you need to have both.
Bueno, entonces pasemos a la siguiente pregunta, que tiene que ver con cuáles son las implicaciones para el enfoque terapéutico.
Right. For the therapist, it takes away a certain kind of safety net that the therapist, somebody with my techniques that I've learned, the client comes in and this is the client. So there's a certain kind of safety net in that. Whereas if we're exploring the field of possible contacts, I have to be putting aside a sense of I know and I'm leading which way this is going. And we are co-experimenters in this field of relationship. I wrote an article about 3 levels of Gestalt therapy training, which I think fits in here. The first level is that the trainee is learning to listen to the client, to show the client that he or she is being listened to. And that's a really important level. In the second level, the trainer shows the student that they're supposed to be also paying attention to their experience. But it's not very clear why you're doing that. At this stage, often the therapy gets less useful because the therapist is saying things like, I now feel an itch in my leg or whatever. And it allows them to go on to the third level, which is where you get the sense that the therapy is about who we are with each other and what we're becoming with each other. Then what we hear from the client and what we notice in ourselves are both parts of being aware of that. So suddenly there's a grounding for that. The other implication is the question that I ask in my latest book, which is, who is the client? It seems like a funny question, but what comes in and shows itself formally in this way of looking is not the client, but the fixed patterns of the client, the personality function or the self-concept of the client. In fact, the person's come to therapy because that self-concept no longer works for them in their lives, and that brings them to therapy. So you can get a strange situation where they've come because they feel trapped by this personality, and yet the therapist treats that personality as if that's the client, tries to attune to that. But the client, if you like, is the actor who's playing that role, not the role. What we're doing is trying to get behind the scenes of this production. What is being shown, what is being avoided, what is out of awareness, what are the places where this relationship will not go, what are the fears in that place, those sort of questions. And those can be very much missed if you treat the presentation of the client when they've come into the therapy room as that is the client, because that is going to be changing as the therapy happens. They're going to be starting taking different roles. I could give you a kind of more extended case study if that would be useful for you. A woman came to see me with panic attacks. This was a problem for her because, apart from the panic attacks, she was a senior cognitive behavioral therapist, and they are not supposed to have panic attacks. But it was even worse than that. She went to see a cognitive behavioral therapist about the panic attacks, and she didn't feel helped. And here she was now coming to a Gestalt therapist. So could I stop her having panic attacks? And I said, I wouldn't even want to stop you having panic attacks. It's something very energized. It obviously has something significant to say. So could we just listen to them and see what is being shown in these panic attacks? And as we stayed with that, she discovered things about the violence in her family, about her difficulties with her staff team at work. She used to do a lot of sport where she could show and use her aggression, and now as she got older she stopped doing that. She started, first of all she made a boundary with her family that she wouldn't see them if they were going to be threatening. She started making different relationships with her work colleagues, and they discovered that they were all dealing with the situation where their manager was bullying them. So she took out a complaint against her manager with the support of her team, and she started sport again with quite a lot of success. So this happened over about 6 months. And she was then at the stage where she applied for and got a much better job. So I then said, by the way, what happened about those panic attacks? And she said, oh, they stopped after a month. And so it's that approach, that's the clinical advantage. People get solutions to problems which they didn't even know existed.
Esto hace un cambio de perspectiva muy revolucionario, sobre todo porque en muchas corrientes terapéuticas, y usted lo plantea en este texto, se puede ver el self como una esencia. Y ahí la pregunta sería, ¿cómo cambiar ese self? Pero también vemos el self como un emergente del contacto de la situación. Y ahí la pregunta que usted propone es cómo tener la sensación de un self continuo.
That's, I think, the important question. There are several answers to that. One, which I think is very important, is a relative continuity of environment. My family were a refugee family. It's very common in the experience of refugees that they feel a break in their sense of self because the environment has changed so fundamentally. So that's one. A second one is personality function, the story, the narrative of who we are, what Goodman calls the verbal replica of self. But the important thing then to say is that there's an illusion here, that the way I would describe myself now is different to how I would have described myself in the pandemic, different how I would have described myself 10 years, 20 years, 30 years ago, so that the narrative by which I get a sense of continuity is actually not itself continuous, but we act as if it's continuous. But it works enough to give us a sense of continuity, so long as the environment is reasonably coherent. And the third thing to say about that is that this personality function divides in two. There's one side of personality, which is things that we need to move from contact to relationship. Relationship, commitment, relationships with partners, parents, children, friends, work, values, the values by which I will do this, I will not do that. So all these are things which can deepen the contact in a more ongoing way. And the other side of it is the fixed gestalten, the things that people do to stay in what feels familiar and therefore less frightening. And those are the things which usually bring the person to therapy, because, as I said, they come to therapy when that familiar way of doing things no longer works for them. There are some parts which are very supportive of self and some parts which impoverish self. But those are all cumulatively part of, my sense of ongoingness. The other bit, Fritz Perls talked about what he called the implosion. When somebody has been living in a certain way, in a very fixed way, and they now want to move away from that fixed way, the problem they face is an existential one. Now who am I? What do I do? What is of interest? There are no signposts. All the signposts are gone. And it looks like retroflexion. There's a lot of tension. shallow breathing, whatever, no movement. But it isn't retroflexion, because in retroflexion, you stop it blocking a particular impulse. In the implosion, there's lots of energy, but there's no signposts as to what to do with that energy. And what Paul's called the explosion is when you just take your step in a certain direction and say, this now is me in this moment. The fixed ways of being, in a sense, avoid you needing to face the unknown. But change involves having the support and the challenge to be able to face the unknown and find your own next step. Therapists, of course, can't do it for you in that place.
Esto nos lleva entonces a una pregunta y es ¿cuáles serían las implicaciones para el diagnóstico, tomando como referencia todo lo que hemos venido conversando?
Well, the diagnosis is not of a self that is in front of the therapist. The diagnosis is of fixed pattern of behaving that it can easily encompass both the client and the therapist. And the diagnosis then would involve just what we experience in front of us and we experience as our response to that. And it's a diagnosis of what we are making together rather than of what is going on inside the client's head. That's a very different sense of diagnosis. I gave at a conference a way of looking at this in terms of dance, that I'm dancing with somebody I've never danced with before, and we have different ways of dancing. So if the client, has been to a strict dance school where only one kind of dance is allowed, the client will have learned two things. One is how to dance that dance, and the other is how to invite their dance partners to dance that same dance with them. Because it's no good being very good at dancing a waltz if your partner's dancing a tango. The diagnosis is seeing the dance that the client is dancing and feeling the invitation to dance that same dance. But then it's a matter of what to do with that. If I just dance the way the client knows how to dance, then we can have a pleasant dance, but nothing changes. If I impose my way of dancing, then again nothing changes. It's just another system of domination. If we can both phenomenologically lay down our familiar dances and are willing to be clumsy and to step on each other's toes, then slowly we can develop a dance which is just the dance of you and me in that moment. It's not that that is technically a better dance than the others, but that the client will have recovered their spontaneity and creativity. So the diagnosis is about the fixed dances of the client and of the invitations to the therapist. I don't see anything problematic about doing diagnosis. I know there's been quite a lot of critique of even thinking about diagnosis in the Gestalt field, but I think there are two statements which don't contradict. One is that each person is unique, and the other is that the ways of limiting yourself in difficult times, those ways are not unique. They become very familiar if you do therapy for a time. And they can be labeled, and you can make a list of them. But that is within the personality. That is not the a diagnosis of self. It's not a diagnosis of the client. It's a diagnosis of the fixed patterns that we get caught up in, which can be very useful to see, and to be able to speak about with the client, and to take to supervision, and to remind myself of the traps which I could fall into. The aim is to orient myself to providing experiments in contact and awareness that take us beyond those fixed patterns, to try something different, whether that is role-playing another part of the personality, or of pushing each other, experimenting with touch, or many, many different things. With couples, if they're caught up in an ever-continuing battle over something, ask them to continue the battle, but to play the opposite role. So they discover themselves in that polarization. So there are lots of different experiments which lead us towards the possibility of discovering something new, discovering that the world isn't the world of our childhood.
Hay una pregunta que generalmente surge en los grupos de entrenamiento iniciales y es la siguiente. ¿Qué pasa cuando algo de la historia del paciente toca la herida, toca la historia del terapeuta? ¿Cómo puede entonces el terapeuta acompañar al paciente aun cuando se ha tocado algo de su herida? Porque es la gran pregunta siempre en los grupos de entrenamiento.
It's usually the most common and biggest question in the training groups.
Además que está asociado siempre con el tema de la contratransferencia, y eso es un error en el proceso terapéutico.
Right. I think this puts a different light on all those questions, because I see it as absolutely fine to be moved by the client. I still have a need through my training and supervision and personal therapy to be able to hold my groundedness while being moved. I also need to get a sense of whether I'm being moved because of some kind of commonality of experience between the client and me, or whether, as also happens, the client is trying to pull out a certain emotional response from me by showing themselves in a certain way. So again, even the way in which I feel moved has a relational background which can be supportive of change and can be a way of keeping things fixed. So there are some clients who are very good at getting therapists to feel sorry for them and to despair of anything, changing. There are clients who are good at getting therapists to feel anger or feel fear, or to feel not good enough. How to distinguish between pain that comes from relationship, from that first part of personality, and the pain that comes from the second part, where I'm being pulled into a dance of sadness and despair, say with a depressed client. But the primary thing is that I allow my feelings, because those are what gives me information about what's happening, and that I stay grounded, that I have my own possibilities of self-support in those situations.
Usted tiene una afirmación en su texto que es: la tarea del terapeuta es apoyar y estar abierto al cliente para que se vuelva impredecible. Me llamó mucho la atención y me gustaría que pudiera ampliar un poquito más esta afirmación.
You could say that the Gestalt therapy theory of neurosis is unaware predictability, these unaware predictable patterns. And therefore, the movement away from that neurosis is to regain the capacity of being creative, unpredictable. The important thing there for the therapist is that I don't lead the client, because if I'm leading the client, then there's no basis for unpredictability. I need to be open to my unpredictability, to be able to play with possibilities with the client, not act as if this situation is completely in accordance with the narrative that's been put on it. If I can do that, if I can stay just open to what happens next, it's a real support for the client to be unpredictable. Miriam Polster had a beautiful definition of Gestalt therapy in 2 sentences. The first one was what is. Second sentence is one thing follows another. So stay with what is and really face what is, and then see what comes next. But the most effective therapies I associate with times when something happens that neither me nor the client know what we're doing. Something happens, but we don't know why it happens or what is happening. I'm remembering with one woman who was very, very aggressively self-critical. Any support or question by the therapist immediately became for her a criticism of herself. She was very quiet, held back from people, because of course people are always criticizing her in her way of experiencing other people. And, we did an experiment. We both stood so that we could move our bodies, and we went quite close to each other and just let whatever develop. And somehow we got to a space where the two of us could stand about this distance apart, screaming at each other with very high volume, and neither was frightened of the other. It was a completely different part of the relational fields that we could find together. And to have that is amazing. It allows new things. I also remember a time when there was a conference, and my long-term co-therapist, John Harris, and me did a presentation of Gestalt therapy in the conference. And there was a man came forward to do a piece of work with John, who had been stammering quite seriously all his life. And he'd been to speech therapists and nothing had changed anything, etc. So he worked with John. And John elicited that he was a tall man, he'd been a large child, and had always been told that if he didn't hold back, that he would really hurt other children. And he stood with a stoop and he stammered. And John heard this, and then he jumped on the client, wrestled him to the ground, and they were rolling along the ground together. And the man got up and started speaking, and he wasn't stammering. That doesn't mean he would never stammer again, but it meant that he had picked up the connection between that childhood experience, the holding back and the stammering. And he had a whole new way forward. So it needed courage from John to engage with this much taller, younger man, but also to be that powerful in his intervention. But with anything less than that, the man would have gone away still stammering. And it shows how just this playing with possibilities together can have a remarkable effect very quickly. I do want to add, as a balancing thing, that if we work with clients with long-term problems around attachment, we know now that those problems lead to deficits in neural development as well. So the whole change takes a lot longer and needs a therapist to be able to stay there and to offer things that the client feels is very alien before things can change. So it's not necessarily such a quick thing. But when the change starts happening, it doesn't happen in slow, incremental stages. When there is enough support, interpersonal, neurological, environmental, change can happen extremely quickly. But the paradigm of change is, can I share my screen? Can you give me permission to share my screen? We know this picture of a vase or faces. What happens is we flick backwards and forwards between these two ways of gestalting, of patterning the picture. We can't see both at the same time, but we can alternate between them. And what Gestalt therapy says is that the change is like that we remake the figure. We bring things which were in the background to the foreground, and we move things that were in the foreground to the background. And that must be instantaneous, just like with the vase and the faces. What makes what takes the time is the developing of the support around the changes, that the person needs support to be able to jump into the unknown, to see faces that he or she has never seen or related to before, instead of just vases. So it's a very different paradigm of change.
Ahora, como última pregunta, hace ciertas puntualizaciones acerca de la fenomenología que llamaron mucho mi atención. Entonces me gustaría saber un poco el tema de la fenomenología para usted y para este enfoque.
This is very much a phenomenological approach, but it's not phenomenology as is often written about, like by, say, Spinelli, which has been sort of in some ways invaded by what we could call a person-centered approach, that the therapist holds back their understanding in order to understand the client's understanding better. But that isn't what Husserl and the phenomenologists meant. And it isn't what I'm talking about. So going back to the image of dancing, this putting down of our familiar way of dancing and discovering a dance which is new for this moment is phenomenology. But it also deals with a potential real problem in phenomenology, which is that it's clear, of course, that we interpret what we receive, we look in a certain way, we understand it in a certain relatively fixed way. But it's very easy to slide from that into that I can't know you, I can only know my interpretation of you, and you can only know your interpretation of me. And in fact, it's actually quite difficult not to slide into that. But once you've slid that way, then contact has no meaning and love has no meaning. So I love my projection onto my wife, and my wife loves her projection onto me, is very dissatisfying. But it's not easy to get away from. But if you say that self and other are co-forming in the contact, then in the contact moment, I am part of who you are and you are part of who I am. And therefore, in this contact moment, we can know each other. It doesn't mean we can know about each other or that we can understand what the other person's thinking. But it means that we can engage with each other on the basis of what we co-create in the contact. And I think that's the only way out of that dilemma, the only way to really end up being able to talk about contact and love. So that's where I am with phenomenology. I used to be a philosopher, and I really like Husserl particularly. See a lot of parallels with what I've been saying and what Husserl was writing towards the end of his career. And he emphasized that human beings aren't outside of the field of consciousness, that we are always inside this field. We can never treat ourselves as being just external observers. And I think that he shared that with Gestalt therapy. In fact, if I look at the language of Paul's Hefferlein and Goodman book, and I look at the language of The Crisis of European Science, one of the last things that Husserl wrote, the language is so similar that at first I thought that Goodman had stolen it from Husserl. But in fact, the Pearls, Hefferlein and Goodman book was written long before any English translation of Husserl. I don't think that Husserl plagiarized it from Goodman. I think there was a parallel development.
Bueno, creo que podemos cerrar acá. De verdad que muchísimas gracias por compartir con nosotros todo lo que tiene, todos sus textos, bueno, parte de su pensamiento. Y le envío un abrazo enorme desde Colombia a Manchester y bueno, espero podamos seguir en contacto. Pero de verdad que muchas gracias por extender acá todo su pensamiento.
I hope it was useful, and I wish you all the best in your researches and your development. I've never been to Colombia, been to Mexico, and I've been to Uruguay, where my son's wife comes from.
But you're welcome to Colombia anytime. Thank you very much. That was beautiful.
Okay, so all the very best. Bye.
Thank you.